And now I'm talking to Maeve Bateman, the Director of the Debt and Development Coalition. Maeve, how's it going? Maeve, a few years ago I interviewed Nassani Cassidy, who used to work for the Debt and Development Coalition, and just over 2 years ago I interviewed Ada Ryan, who worked there. First of all, could you give us a reminder of who the DDCI are, why you were founded, and can you tell me about the work you do today, please?
Sure. So we were founded 25 years ago this year in response to the growing debt crisis, primarily affecting African countries at that time. And so there was a group of concerned citizens, including international development NGOs, some returned missionaries, lots of different people who had seen the effects that the financial system was causing in the debt crisis and wanted to create a group to deal with that. Since then, in addition to debt, we also work on tax justice. And in addition to focusing on developing countries, we also look at how these issues affect countries in Ireland. So the way we work is we carry out research, we do policy and advocacy, but a lot of what we do is campaigning and education. So we work with community groups and with adult education, through trainee teachers to get to schools, through some student groups, and we also have public events like the ones we've had in the last week.
We're here today to talk about those events you had recently. You had 3 events recently. The third, which was only held last night and yesterday and Wednesday. Could you give me a summary of what these events were called, first of all, why you had them, and could you tell me what kind of feedback you got at them?
Sure. So the first event we had was looking at the new global debt crisis, and that was in Dublin last week. And we had a speaker over from the UK, Tim Jones from the Jubilee Debt Coalition, and a speaker joining us from the Mozambique Debt Group, Humberto Zakia, who joined us via Skype. And that was an opportunity to talk to people about how, even though the issue of global debt seems to have gone off the agenda, we've lots of evidence showing that particularly countries in the developing world are starting to be affected again by debt burdens and the risks that poses. The second event was in Galway, and we had it jointly with the Galway One World Society and the Galway Housing Network, and we were trying to make the links there between the role of vulture funds internationally and the role they've played in debt cases and again in developing countries, with the role that they're now playing in housing in Ireland, and maybe opportunities for solidarity and links there. And then the final event last night, it was done jointly with Colov as part of their First Wednesdays debates, and we were asking whether Ireland is a tax haven or a development ally. And so we'd some interesting speakers. We'd Mary Cosgrove from NUI Galway and John Christensen, who's the director of the UK Tax Justice Network, and we were kind of analysing what the different perspectives were. And in terms of the reaction, we had really great engagement at all the events, lots of different perspectives. I think the debt crisis event, people were really interested to learn more, particularly about the situation in Mozambique, which a lot of people haven't heard about, and some really good questions for Humberto about that. In Galway, it was great with the housing activists to just get that exchange of, kind of their experience of what's happening in Galway really specifically, and then how that links into what's happening internationally. And then last night, again, a really diverse audience, lots of different people, and some of them hadn't really thought of tax from a justice angle before and were really interested to hear about how it affects internationally, and others were kind of interested about the challenges that it poses to our tax regime and what it means for the future.
Just to talk a bit more about the 3 events individually, not necessarily in order now, but how serious of a problem do you think the problem of vulture funds are around the world?
I think it's a very serious problem. We've seen a lot of individual countries face really negative consequences where vulture funds have got involved. And to explain to people who might not know, when we talk about vulture funds, we're talking about investment funds where the way they work is they buy debt really cheap, distressed debt that there's already been an issue with that's been written down, and then they take quite extreme, often legal measures to try and claim the full value of that debt. So they might buy a debt that's been cut back to maybe 5% of its original value, because the original creditor who made the loan knows that the borrower isn't in a position to pay it back, and then they will take them to court. They will pursue lots of unusual ways of trying to get that money, and so where they've been successful, they've made profits of 1,600%, huge degrees of profit, and so in the way they work, traditionally, a lot of it has been in country debt, in the bond markets, but more recently they've been engaged in property, and that's something that's been happening in Ireland, where they're now our largest private landlord.
Yeah, I've heard NAMA implicated a lot with vulture funds. Is that true?
So basically, when the government and NAMA were trying to sell on the portfolio, they invited in the vulture funds. They courted them, and they, encouraged them to invest in the country. And that's not really disputed. There's also been a lot of controversy about the tax deals that they were offered, and the loopholes they managed to exploit, meaning that they paid a very low percentage of tax. Now, the government would argue that they needed a big purchaser to come in. And our concern is that, based on the way vulture funds have operated internationally, there's a real risk that the way they treat these houses is going to have negative effects on the people who live in them in the future.
Do you think we're going to hear a lot more about these vulture funds in Ireland and internationally?
I think so. So in Spain, there's been a huge movement. A very large number of people were evicted in Spain from apartment blocks that vulture funds have owned. It's not happened on a large scale here yet, and obviously we'll be hopeful that a situation like that doesn't happen. And it really depends on if they're able to make profit in other ways from those investments. But I think based on the way they've worked previously, it's likely that they're going to be putting pressure on the residents more and more. And I think as time goes on, especially given how dire the situation is for housing here anyway, we're going to hear more about that.
And how many people in Spain lost their houses or apartments, do you know?
Ooh, I don't know off the top of my head. I do know there was a really big movement, and you can see some great YouTube videos they've made as part of the resistance. I think there were quite a lot. I mean, I definitely think in the thousands of people affected, but how that they were also, some of them were quite successful in some of the techniques they had. So yeah, it was a big thing in Spain.
What are your proposals to the government on vulture funds?
I think that we would there's a few different things. So there's vulture funds have a role in a number of different ways. So there's the role they play internationally, and there's the role they play nationally. Some countries in Europe, particularly Belgium, have brought in laws against vulture funds with their international debt, laws that say that they can't get more than the headline price for a debt that they paid for it. So it cuts out their ability to make huge profits and stops the incentive to behave so aggressively. Whether that's less likely to be possible in housing, but we would ask the government to look at the regulation. They're treated very differently because vulture funds aren't banks here. They aren't under any of the current regulation that other lenders are. So we'd really want the government to extend all the regulation they can, and to rethink why they invited them in the first place, and maybe look at their tactics for that.
Just to talk about another event you had recently, the issue of debt. How bad of a problem is the issue of national debt around the world today, in your opinion?
I think at the moment all the signs say that we're headed for another crisis. So, I mean, in the 90s, obviously, we had this huge issue where in the 90s and the mid-2000s, there was some debt write-down for countries in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, and developing countries that were affected, where everyone agreed the debt was just unsustainable. And then following the financial crisis 10 years ago, we had our own issues in debt here and in Greece, across Europe. And now where things are going, it looks like the developing world again is going to face more of the same. We've seen the levels of debt being taken out by countries has gone up and up in recent years, linked in with the commodities markets. And at this stage, we're not fully in a crisis, but we're seeing lots of signs that make us very, very concerned. And for some countries, like Mozambique, there's already problems with repayments, and that has an effect on governments being able to pay for things like schools and teachers and nurses and doctors, and it really affects the ordinary people living in those countries.
Is it true that there are, I think, 5 or 6 countries who, in developing countries, who are really now in trouble with debt, along with Mozambique, like?
There are lots. So, I mean, sort of the exact figures and the exact countries, it sort of varies depending on the metric you use. But I think there's no doubt that there are countries that have significant issues repaying at the moment, and there needs to be a way to deal with that. So something that we have always called for is a UN body that will be responsible, that countries could go to when it comes to their debt, when their debts become unmanageable, that would settle these things. At the moment, there's no body globally that deals with debt, and countries have no options. They can go through the courts, but most of these debts are taken out under either English law or New York law, so that they kind of, there's a big legal battle on their hand if they go that way, and there's no real way to get the debt written off. Previously, when we did do that, they were one-off things that happened, and so we need some kind of permanent mechanism that can deal with countries' debt and be established on a permanent basis.
And these 5 or 6 countries, developing countries, how does their debt compare to Ireland? Because I understand that Ireland, our country, is one of the most indebted countries in the world as well. Like,
so the real difference is actually just in terms of what we say we can repay, and that's one of the things that makes debt a challenging issue. It's not just about how much you owe, it's about your capacity to repay it. Ireland's debt remains one of the worst as in relation to our GDP in the whole world, and that is still having an effect. Absolutely, we're still paying it off. We're going to be paying it off for a large number of years. But because of sort of a certain amount of growth in the economy, and because of the way the debts have been structured and spread out over a long time, the government is prioritising paying that debt. So we're not seen to be in a debt crisis, even though in many ways for a number of years, the way the government paid that debt was by prioritising it over other services that had to be cut. When it comes to some of the more troubled developing countries, the only thing that really changes is the ability to pay is often worse, and the kind of services that are being cut are, well, believe it or not, even more essential. But I mean, ultimately, we haven't got to a good position. We still, despite the fact that we don't talk about it so much anymore, it used to be in the papers all the time, our debt is still what most people would consider at worryingly high levels. But the thing that isn't raising alarm bells is that we're continuing to make the repayments.
And is it true, this is the assumption I hear when it's been talked about, if there is another global recession, that we're going to be in big trouble because of the size of our debt? Like,
I think it's really hard to know what kind of shape a new global recession will take, and I think it'll depend a lot on how we're affected. I mean, I think definitely we will be worried. One of the big things that came up at our tax event last night was how exposed we are to international multinationals moving their money through Ireland, and how, I guess, precarious Ireland is in that way. That, you know, we've built our economic policy, a lot of it is dependent on multinational investment, and we claim that multinational investment is dependent on our tax rate. Well, increasingly other countries are cutting their tax rates down like ours. You know, countries may choose to leave, and so there are lots of situations that if they all come together, they could quite negatively affect us.
Before we talk about the final event you had, you mentioned it briefly there, your tax event yesterday. Just to finish up talking about debt, you mentioned there that you want a UN body to be set up to manage national debt around the world from every country. Are there any other proposals you have for the Irish government and the EU and the other governments, like, to expand on that? Like,
I think the main thing that what we want in general is to see a recognition of the fact that there needs to be a way for countries to be able to write down debts that aren't affordable. And that's where the UN body will come in. But also that we need to place more of the responsibility on the people lending the money. At the moment, we act as though the only people who are responsible are the people taking out the loans. But in reality, this money is being offered from somewhere. It's being used to make a profit, and we think there needs to be much tighter regulation. The case of Mozambique, which Humberto was telling us about in detail, what actually happened there was that 2 European banks, including Credit Suisse, lent money that was given to the Mozambican government, but was actually used. It was a secret debt. It was channeled through companies set up, and it went to benefit members of that government. So it's seen widely to be an illegitimate debt, even though it's on Mozambique's balance sheets. But the big question is, how on earth was that able to happen? How on earth did those banks not stop with their own checks and their own due diligence? And so I think the biggest thing we can do is start holding banks to account, because as we learnt with our own debt crisis, we take on the responsibility when things go wrong, so that we need to be holding them to a high standard.
If you're an individual or a small company, I think if you have a big debt, you could be declared bankrupt and the debt is wiped. But that's not the case with countries. It's not like national governments.
Yeah, that's right, and that's again one of the big issues. Like debts can carry on for generations and generations, and there's a real question about, well, if the government took on a debt in the name of its people, but the people didn't consent to that debt, they didn't know what it was used for, it wasn't used on anything that benefited them, well then, should those people, or even more likely those people's grandchildren, be forced to pay this money back, to see cuts in their services to service this debt? And if we think the answer is no, well then why don't we have a system that enables us to look at these cases and to say, well look, obviously, in the case of Mozambique, that money never went near the public, so that why should they pay it back? That should be fairly straightforward. And in more complicated cases, there are still cases that need to be heard and recognised, and compromises that need to be reached, and we just need a way of dealing with those.
Are there other organisations you work with? I don't know about debt, but debt, for if you want to talk about that, but tax justice as well. I understand Christian Aid and Oxfam and maybe Action Aid do a lot of work on this as well.
Yeah, so we're part of the Irish Tax Justice Network, which was founded a few years ago, and in that we work with Christian Aid, Oxfam, Trócaire, Action Aid Ireland and Attack Ireland are some of the main people. And then internationally, we'd worked with Jubilee Debt Campaign in the UK, who do a lot of work on debt, and an organisation called Eurodad, the European Agency on Debt and Development. And they have great publications, and if people are interested to find out more, there's lots of reports, as well as on our own website around it. But through all these groups, and there's a global debt group as well, it means that we're able to kind of share information and take joint action, and it's really good to be part of that movement.
Yeah, we talk about the last event you had that was held yesterday. You've already spoken a bit about it already. Do you believe that the Republic of Ireland is a tax haven?
So one of the things that came up yesterday was about how hard it is to define that phrase. I mean, I absolutely believe that the Republic of Ireland is involved in facilitating companies to move money through our tax practices that should be taxed elsewhere, and whether we do that knowingly, whether we just don't close our loopholes or we don't examine it enough, in a way it almost doesn't matter. The net result, which I think is really clear, is that developing countries who we provide aid to, who, as individuals, there's a lot of history of charitable giving, there's a lot of solidarity that's been expressed, but in reality, our tax practices, they really undermine that, and they have a really negative effect. And there's lots of different ways in which that happens. So one of them is the fact that we're at the front of this global movement to really cut down on corporate income tax rates. And now the effect of that is once corporate income tax rates go down, then value-added tax goes up. So the VAT rate on things has been rising globally. We've one of the higher VAT rates in Europe, actually. And that means that ordinary people have to pay more for their goods and services while corporations contribute less. And when we lower our rates, it put pressure on other countries to lower theirs. And a lot of countries in Europe in the last few years have been reducing their rates. There's also the tax deals we strike with developing countries, so the tax treaties, which often reduce the amount of tax that they can charge for their people. But I think the most important of all is the way that we allow companies to use quite complex tax structures to move their money through Ireland in a way that means that they pay much less tax than they might otherwise expect to pay in countries where most of their business takes place. And that's a real challenge for developing countries. And at the moment, we don't even share information that allows them to identify when this has happened. We've made huge improvements in some ways. We share information with tax authorities, but we really think that information needs to be made public so we can identify where there are risks and we can identify where it looks likely that tax avoidance is going on.
You mentioned there has been some improvements. I know some politicians and people in the media around Europe, if not around the world, think that Ireland is a tax haven. Some people in Ireland do as well. And the term the double Irish, that could be gone now, I'm not sure. But is there any evidence that there were kind of backroom secret deals done over the years as regards multinationals in Ireland, or is it above board but like it's still kind of not good? Like,
well, it's funny because I think the answer is there were backroom deals done, but that's the way the system works. So it's crazy at the moment. We have these advanced pricing agreements where we sit down and we explain to multinationals how we're going to treat different transactions they have. What that ultimately means, though, is that they can try a lot of different scenarios and eventually come to the one in which they pay the least tax. And these aren't subject to any real oversight. There's no transparency. We really think that it's important that the government pay attention to this, because at the moment, I mean, when the Apple state aid case came out, it was clear that the revenue and the Minister of Finance were about the only people who knew certain aspects of it. So ordinary TDs, the Public Accounts Committee, they weren't aware of the content of these deals. And so one of the big things that we think is necessary is that we have much greater transparency. It can be anonymous, but we need to understand how this money is moving through and what's happening. And it helps us identify loopholes. So you mentioned the double Irish. They finally said they'll close the double Irish and companies will stop being able to use it from 2020. But a recent report from Christian Aid Ireland highlighted that there's already a new game in town that they're calling the single malt. So there's a way that countries use having companies here and in Malta to do more or less the same thing they did with the double Irish.
How do you spell that, the single malt? M-A-L-T, is it?
Yeah, M-A-L-T, yeah.
I hope we haven't forgotten to cover anything big about your three events. If we have, you might like to say something.
I mean, I think the main thing is just to say if people are interested to find out more, we try and sort of have reports and things available. We try and share lots of articles on the website and our Facebook pages and Twitter and things like that. I think the main thing about the events is what we're trying to do is we're trying to get people to have a conversation about these issues and make people realise that it's accessible. Like all of these things, they deal with how the government spends our money and how they cover the cost of, you know, hospitals and transport and all these basic things here and how they cover our relations overseas. So we'd like more and more people to get involved with this, to start asking their TDs questions. I think sometimes it's made sound like it's very hard, like it's a really complicated subject, the way it's discussed on the news, the way it's discussed in general. And the reality is it's not that difficult, and it's something everyone everyone should feel able to have a conversation about and to challenge our TDs about, because it really underpins how the country works and lots of very important issues.
You're on Facebook, Twitter, and I think YouTube as well, aren't you? So, okay, Maeve, it's great talking to you. We're talking again. Thanks very much, right?
Thank you.